Hi, my name is Miles Sheehan. I'm the director of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics here at Georgetown University Medical Center. I'm delighted that you're here today for our conversation on nursing ethics and bioethics, perspectives and prospects for the future. Before we begin our program, I hope you'll allow me to share a little bit about Dr. John Harvey, in whom this program is named. Dr. Harvey was a distinguished clinician, researcher, and medical educator. A graduate of Yale University and the Johns Hopkins Medical School, Dr. Harvey was a faculty member at Hopkins before moving to Georgetown in 1973. Dr. Harvey was a leader in establishing the specialty of geriatric medicine. He was also a man of deep Catholic faith, and in 1989, he received a PhD in moral theology from St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore. He was a close friend of Dr. Edmund Pellegrino and worked as a faculty member with Georgetown Center for Clinical Bioethics until his death in 2017. Having had the privilege of meeting Dr. Harvey, regrettably just once, but it was a great meeting, I can testify to his warmth, his humor, and his erudition. Our moderator today is Dr. Sarah Vitone. Sarah is Associate Professor and Senior Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Master of Science Entry to Nursing programs at the Georgetown University School of Nursing. Sarah is an essential member of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, and she does wonderful work as a clinical ethicist on our consultation service at the Georgetown University MedStar Georgetown University Hospital. So Sarah, I invite you to take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miles. I am very pleased to moderate the panel today and guide our conversation on nursing ethics and bioethics. I would like to remind the audience to please use the Q&A feature and submit questions that I will bring forward for our panelists after they share their perspectives. We will be hearing from expert nurses with many years of experience in a variety of environments where nursing ethics and bioethics have had a profound impact and influence in their lives. Today's discussion will include the interconnected principles and values guiding nursing ethics, the key role ethics can have on professional formation, the role of ethical voice and moral agency on healthcare practice, prospects for the future of nursing ethics, and reflections on the work of Dr. John Collins Harvey in bioethics and the patient-nurse-provider relationship. Our panelists are, and I'm going to welcome them on stage now, Ms. Kara Curry, Senior Policy and Ethics Advisor, Center for Ethics and Human Rights and Nursing Practice and Work Environments at the American Nurses Association. And Dr. Barbara Bennett Jacobs, Clinical Ethicist, Hartford Healthcare, and Associate Professor in Residence, University of Connecticut School of Nursing. And Dr. Carol Taylor, Professor of Medicine and Nursing, former director and founding member of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, and Dr. Margaret Harvey Granito, nurse practitioner, MedStar Connected Care Cardiology. Welcome, all my friends. Margaret, I'd like to begin with you. You received your bachelor's degree in nursing from Georgetown University and recently served on the faculty of the School of Nursing for 15 years. Margaret, tell us a little bit about your dad and what makes him tick.
Well, first, a shout out to the Hoya nurses out there. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And I am so happy to be back on the hilltop with my friends and former colleagues, Dr. Taylor and Dr. Vitone, as the Harvey family rep to share a little bit about my dad. So first, some fun facts. My dad came from a medical family. His father was a cardiologist and his mother was a nurse who cared for Allied soldiers on the front lines in France during World War I. His only sibling was also a physician, an orthopedic surgeon. While they were very close until my uncle's death, the two brothers were fiercely competitive. One went to Dartmouth, so the other went to Yale. One went to Harvard Med School, so the other went to Hopkins. One served in the Army, so the other joined the Navy, and so on it went until their 90s. I think this brotherly competition contributed to my dad's deeply held value of excellence in all things. He knew he wanted to be a physician at the age of 11 and never wavered from this vocation. He was a practicing Catholic and a deeply spiritual person who believed that each life was sacred. He saw each of his patients, students, colleagues, and the strangers he met along the way as unique individuals and acknowledged their innate dignity and worth as persons. He was obliged to live following the moral imperatives, love your neighbor, and do no harm. He was a person for others. He met my mom during second grade while they were both preparing for First Holy Communion. And by fourth grade, the family folklore is that he was smitten. He used to ride by her house on his bicycle at the age of 12 and yell out, "Adele Dillon, I'm going to marry you," and would greet her on the train station platform as she returned home from college with a small musical band. For the next 15 years, he was met by my mom sticking out her tongue and laughing. But persistence and patience do pay off. When she finally said yes in 1949, they married 3 months later and were partners in all things for the next 61 years. My mom and their family were my dad's greatest treasures. He also loved to travel. In 1933, at the age of 10, he attended the World Scout Jamboree in Hungary. He continued to be a lifelong wanderer and traveled for both work and pleasure. He took advantage of the academic tradition of the sabbatical, and every 7 years was off to be a visiting professor. Our family was packed up and went along to London and Cambridge, England, and Ibadan, Nigeria, to name a few of the places we would live for 6 months at a time. He loved planning the itineraries and acting as tour guide for family trips. In his later years, he traveled with his grandchildren and took them all over the world. His last adventure at the ripe old age of 87 was traveling to Mongolia to show 2 of his grandsons a yurt. Finally, the most endearing qualities of my father were his sense of humor and his love of life. He loved to laugh, and importantly, he could laugh at himself. He enthusiastically joined in any adventure and truly savored the personal relationships he had with others.
Margaret, that is so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing about your dad. I am pleased to have worked with him, and that was so special. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about how your father got involved in bioethics?
Well, I think lifelong learning characterized my dad's professional life. He had a thirst for knowledge and read and wrote voraciously. On Sunday afternoons in the summer, when he was supposed to be in charge of my siblings and me at the beach, he perched under the shade with his pile of beach reads that consisted of JAMA journals, the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle's Metaphysics, and the latest papal encyclicals. When he came to Georgetown in 1973, he further involved himself in the important moral and ethical dilemmas of the day as a senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute and later at the Center.for.Clinical.Bioethics. And this really remained his professional focus until his death in 2017. It is important to understand the post-World War II changes that were taking place in American society that influenced the development of healthcare ethics broadly and the field of bioethics specifically. Up until the 1950s, the role of patients remained to trust their physicians and to submit passively to whatever treatments their physicians deemed appropriate. But in 1957, the Slago versus Leland case was decided in favor of the plaintiff, who claimed that his physicians had been negligent in failing to warn him of the risks associated with the procedure. In a decision that awarded damages to Mr. Slago, the court announced a new legal doctrine, informed consent. And this required physicians to provide patients with all relevant information about available treatment alternatives. I think we also must acknowledge the other influences of these years surrounding consumer rights, civil rights, and healthcare reform. In 1954, the Supreme Court desegregated schools. In 1962, President Kennedy gave an address to Congress about the rights of consumers, which he described as the right to safety, the right to be informed, the right to choose, and the right to be heard. The civil rights movement was in full swing, punctuated by Dr. Martin Luther King's 1963 I Had a Dream speech. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed into law. In 1965, Ralph Nader, a familiar name I hope, published Unsafe at Any Speed, which was the seminal event in the emergence of the consumer rights movement. And then also in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed into law and the Medicare, Medicaid programs were established. It was really shortly after these events that a group of scholars separated themselves from the mainstream of moral philosophy and established what was to become the new discipline of bioethics. There is still a great debate over when bioethics as a discipline developed and what the early focus was. The earliest use of the word is found in 1926 and is credited to a German theologian and teacher, Fritz Jahr. There is no doubt, however, about the tremendous role Georgetown University played. And there is no doubt that the scholars at the Hastings Center, founded in 1969, and the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, founded in 1971, propelled the discipline forward. These two think tanks were extremely instrumental in directing the scope of the emerging field and influential in its evolution. Doctors Beecher, Callahan, Beecham, Childress, Reich, Helligers, Engelhard, Abel, along with my father, shaped American bioethics as a distinct discipline focused on Beecham and Childress's 4 universal principles: autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, and justice used in ethical reasoning and decision-making. These were known as the Georgetown mantra in the ethics community around the world and remain the core truths of American bioethics to this day. Dr. Pellegrino came to Georgetown in 1982 and joined this illustrious group. He was instrumental in establishing the Georgetown Center for Clinical Bioethics in 1991, with the focus of bringing expertise in clinical practice, philosophy, theology, law, and basic science to the ethical challenges that arise in the care of particular patients. Doctors Taylor and Vitone have long been associated with the center. Lifelong learning also characterized my dad's relationship with the nursing profession. Over the course of 7 decades, his perception of nursing changed dramatically. Remember, he started practicing medicine in the 1950s when the physician was king, and the role of MD was to diagnose and treat disease without thought to a patient's preference. Nursing was secondary to the physician role of healer. But on a daily basis, my dad saw the impact that nurses had at the bedside, the caring, empathy, and compassion nurses practiced, and the education and advocacy they provided to their patient partners was equally as important to the patient's spiritual, psychological, and physical health as the treatments he ordered. He rounded with the bedside nurses caring for his patients long before it was a Joint Commission requirement. An August 2023 article by Connie Ehrlich and Christine Grady in Nurse Ethics sums up the role and importance of nurse bioethicists as, quote, central to the future goals of healthcare, bringing a unique perspective to the day-to-day ethical challenges of both clinical care and research, as well as to the education of health professionals and the public. This leads us back to our panel discussion with Dr. Taylor, Dr. Curry, and Dr. Jacobs. I know my dad in heaven is eager to hear your thoughts on one of his favorite topics. So thank you.
Margaret, that was brilliant. That was a great history and review and where your dad fit into that. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I am pleased now to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Carol Taylor, who came to Georgetown in 1987. You were a founding member, former director of the Center for Clinical Bioethics, and are a Kennedy Institute Senior Scholar. I also want to highlight for the audience that your influence in nursing as the primary author of Fundamentals of Nursing, the Art and Science of Person-Centered Nursing Care, now in its 10th edition, is an amazing impact in the formation of our young nurses. Carol, would you share a little bit about your understanding of how ethics has influenced from you being a nurse, and what have been some of those key influences on your development of ethics?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm actually delighted to be on this panel honoring Dr. Harvey. When we worked together at the center, whenever I sought wisdom, it was John that I went to, and I never found him lacking. And just a very quick anecdote, he had a major heart event, was in our hospital for several days. When he came back to work, I said, John, what was that experience like? And he said, reflected for a moment. He said, the nurses today are like the residents in my day. They read the strips, they titrated the meds. And then there was that pregnant butt. And he said, I was in the unit for 3 days before somebody offered mouth care. He said, I'm enough of a dinosaur. I remember when nurses gave back massages as part of PM care, and I would have loved that. And then strikingly, he said, this was my first brush with mortality. And nobody asked me what that experience was like, what my fears were. And he wasn't telling nurses to go back to being handholders, but he was saying, were we progressing at the expense of something that was essential to who we were? So I'm not sure that I would characterize my ethics as nursing ethics. I am sure that who I am as a nurse has influenced the way I do and how I teach healthcare ethics. And so a few words about formative influences. I was extremely fortunate in 1993 to have a National Endowment Humanities grant, and it was offered to teams of university philosophy and nurse professors. We spent 3 weeks at Tufts University with the goal of going back home to develop a course in nursing ethics. And we had Andy Jaminton for that first week. And many of you know Andy because the following year in '84, he published his seminal text on nursing practice and became famous for coining the term moral distress. And while I treasure that, what I most treasure about Andy and what I'm grateful to him for was his recognition of the role nurses play in responding to human suffering. And this is just a short quote from that text. He said, when I argue that nurses play a central role in healthcare, I base this claim on the view that they represent the central and most significant value of healthcare, a compassionate response to suffering. And he said, because this value is central, I believe nurses have a central moral responsibility for the conduct of healthcare. And he tied that into patient advocacy, and he made a strong claim that nursing insights need to be recognized in decisions, not only about patients at the bedside, but in policy decisions. And I just need to get that message out a little more strongly, because I think it's maybe a piece of Andy that many of us have forgotten. In '85, I came to the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, to their Summer Institute in Ethics, and started my foundation in what my friend and colleague Dan Clauser soon called and critiqued principlism. But it wasn't just the 4 principles that were part of that foundation, because when I came back in '87 to start my doctoral work in philosophy, I selected Ed Pellegrino to direct my dissertation committee. And what I wrote about was the morality internal to the practice of nursing. And unlike the principalist, if you want to call them that, Beecham and Childress, Ed grounded the moral obligations of healthcare professionals in the fact of illness, which he termed human vulnerability, in the promises that we make as healthcare professionals to work with patients to secure their health and well-being, and then in our joint work toward right and good healing actions. And if we think about that, it's a very different orientation than that proposed by the 4 principles. And probably as a full-time educator now, I work all the time in our advanced practice DMP and soon PhD program with nurses who only want to furl the banner of autonomy and change patients to customers and give them whatever they want. And that's not our tradition. And when Europe identified their 4 principles of bioethics, they were very different than those Margaret cited. They had autonomy, dignity, integrity, vulnerability. Many of us remember Ruth Macklin, famous US ethicist, who said, dignity is a meaningless concept. You show me any nurse who can't tell you when they walk into a room if the treatment goals and care that's being provided violates the intrinsic dignity of the person or promotes it, is respectful of it. Ed Pellegrino was famous for distinguishing scientifically right acts, evidence-based medicine from humanly good. And it was in this context that I eagerly read Sally Godot. And she's famous for the notion of existential advocacy, but it was almost as if she realized, and again, Margaret was talking about paternalistic medicine, but she almost knew that we would move very quickly from that type of paternalism to what the President's Council on Bioethics called patient sovereignty. And she advocated for something in the middle, and she linked existential advocacy to nursing's ability to enter into relationship with patients. And she said, not that nurses are the only ones that do this, but it's who we are. It's what we know. It's in us to work with patients, families, and communities to secure their interests, because we have that insight into not only what they want, but what will best advance their interest. And I have to say, there was a huge difference in the ethics consultations I saw modeled by famous people like Ed Pellegrino, and what I saw nurse ethics consultants do. And you're going to hear from Barbara Jacobs, and not about her work probably with ethics consultation. I think of Barbara, I think of Catherine Brown Saltzman, who directed the Ethics Center at UCLA, people like Ellen Robinson in Mass General. And when they did an ethics consult, it wasn't simply in the medical model of appearing, assessing, and making a recommendation. It was like working with the participants, with the members of the team, until we could do right by that patient or family, and addressing what the Veterans Administration now calls ethics quality gaps. How does the system need to change in order to prevent the recurrence of problems like this? So I want to use the short bit of time I have left to talk about professional caring. AWAN invited me in '93 to describe the ethics of caring. And these characteristics certainly are not unique to Carol Taylor. They build on the work of many wonderful people before me. But it starts with the centrality of the caring relationship, right? We're not anonymous players in healthcare. And we're committed as nurses who practice this ethic of care to promote the dignity and respect of patients as people. And that's respect for their intrinsic dignity. I'll say more about it. And I've had some hard conversations with our advanced practice nurses about patients, sometimes families, communities. They find it difficult to respect. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Another descriptor, it's attention to the particulars of individual patients. When I asked nurses, how do you calibrate your moral compass? So many of them say, well, it's the golden rule, treat others like you want to be treated. And I said, that works if we're all the same. But if we're all different, then treating others as I want to be treated may not be the right thing at all. Fourth descriptor, cultivation of responsiveness to others, professional responsiveness. And many of us in nursing remember Pat Benner's person versus task orientation, but I can choose, and I always say this every day in practice, who I want to be. And I can respond or fail to respond. I can be that one more anonymous face walking into an encounter, or the one that makes the critical difference. So the fundamental moral skills and an ethics of caring are redefined to include virtues like kindness, attentiveness, empathy, compassion, reliability. Think about the significance of this following 1983, when the US Surgeon General says there's an epidemic of loneliness, people feeling isolated, alienated. In every encounter, professional nurses have the ability to challenge that. Nobody cares. And lastly, in an ethic of caring, we pay attention to the ecology of the moral choice or act, and contextual factors matter. So again, this isn't a strictly ... It's how do you put all this together? And it's what makes it exciting. It's what makes it meaningful. It is the meaning and purpose, I believe, of who we are and what we're about. You could see how this commitment to ethical caring played out. In 1995, I worked with the faculty of the Georgetown University School of Nursing to identify the values that we wanted to characterize ourselves. And the values that we selected were excellence. It was an orientation to person and to human flourishing. That's such a high bar, other than what so much of the healthcare system offers. It's professional care and compassion, and figuring out what that looks like anew every day, every year, as technologies and funding and everything else changes. And lastly, a commitment to social justice and to the common good. So when I actually finally wrote my dissertation and tried to parse out the necessary and sufficient conditions for a model of professional caring, I had 6 criteria and tried to plot these out on a continuum using the Aristotelian mean, right? So each of these things matter. They're problematic if they're deficient. They're also problematic if they're excessive. And the first element was affection. So if I'm, and I'm trying to distinguish now professional caring, what we do as nurses, from how I care for a friend, a child, a pet. So affection is that experience of positive regard for the person being cared for. And if I'm an emergency room nurse, and this is somebody with a substance abuse disorder, and they might be cursing me out, they might be physically assaultive, can I go underneath the natural revulsion I might feel to see the person and experience positive regard? The second element is cognition. And I have tremendous respect for health professionals today and what we need to know in order to be competent. So what does it mean to intellectually grasp what's essential to the well-being of the person cared for? What does that look like? How does that play out? Third element, volition. Am I willing to commit my expertise and energy to secure the well-being of the person cared for? Imagination. Can I empathically enter into and share the world of the person cared for? That was Godot's notion of existential advocacy. Motivation. Am I moved to care because of a commitment to secure the well-being of the person cared for? So much since the pandemic is challenging our notion of our moral commitments. And some saying, you know, maybe nursing now is a trade. It's not a profession. And the last element is expression. Demonstrate caring behaviors which are perceived as such by the one cared for. Last note on the development of moral agency, which as a full-time educator is pretty much my life right now. And I recently wrote a chapter with Jennifer Bartlett in which we state, while many define nursing agency as the abilities or capacities nurses possess in order to authentically live the profession's moral identity, we emphasize the importance of cultivating these abilities or capacities in order for nurses to secure the public's trust. Ultimately, both the nurse's abilities and trustworthiness are instrumental to creating the types of partnerships with individuals, institutions, and societies which promote safety, health, and well-being. Nurses with moral agency individually prove themselves trustworthy, but equally important, collectively prove the profession trustworthy, which is no small accomplishment in today's world. And now I eagerly await our next presenter, Dr. Barbara Jacobs. Thank you.
Carol, that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that history and that development over time and how we see ethics and that transformation. I am really pleased to turn over now to Dr. Barbara Jacobs. You're a clinical bioethicist and a nurse. You chair an ethics committee, provide consultations. You have years of teaching in ethics. And you're connected to Georgetown also as a graduate of the bachelor's program in the School of Nursing. And you have close ties to us, having completed a 2-year postdoc fellowship in bioethics at the Center.for.Clinical.Bioethics. Barbara, how does your philosophy of nursing ethics inform your nursing practice in the arena of clinical bioethics?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to say, now that you mentioned that I was at Georgetown for a fellowship in clinical bioethics, obviously that's where I met Dr. Harvey. And I just have to tell you a little anecdote, because some of my fellows are here today with us. And I just want to mention that we used to have to give case presentations to Dr. Harvey and Dr. Collins. And one day, one of us asked if we would all play a certain part in a patient's story. And Dr. Harvey got his assignment early. So he went back to his office, took a white plastic paper bag out of the wastebasket, tied it into a long sort of object, and clipped it to the back of the head because he was to be the mother. it was just so beautiful example of how he could bring relaxation and humor when all of us were nervously presenting cases to him and Dr. Pellegrino. And he just gave that sense of, I'm with you, I understand you, I'm going to comfort you through this presentation. And it was just a joy and a privilege, Margaret, to work with your father. I want to thank Father Sheehan and you, Sarah, for putting this together today. Nothing could be more exciting to me than talking about nursing ethics. Typically, when I make a presentation or even write a paper or an essay, I'll start with a poem. And I want to choose one for today. I'm not going to give you the poem. I'm going to give you the idea of the poem. It's by Wallace Stevens, and it's called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. It has 13 stanzas that are very haiku created, but not overly haiku. But it talks about nature, it talks about the seasons, it talks about the temperature. But it's more than that. It's a poem about perceptions and the pluralistic view of reality that Nietzsche favored when he said, plurality in interpretation is a sign of strength. And that's what that poem is. It says one blackbird, 13 different ways to look at it. So instead of today we're not analyzing the blackbird like Wallace Stevens did, but we're going to analyze the phenomenon of nursing ethics. And I think when we think of it as a plurality of perceptions, we are demonstrating our strength as nurses. And you can see the strength of Carol Taylor and her contribution to the nursing ethics phenomenon. When I was a fellow, I was assigned to discuss a Socratic kind of piece of work done by Plato. And it was actually about Meno, who was a young student who had come to Thessaly, and he had come with a number of his slaves. And the dialogue was a conversation between Meno and Socrates, and it was centered on Meno's question, can virtue be taught? Virtue, which I would define as that habitual predisposition to do good in the moral sense, is the core of the moral character of nursing. I think we would agree, as our nursing original leaders considered it essential to nursing practice. Can we teach nursing ethics? Can we teach moral character? Can we teach Meno's virtue? Or can we teach any part of nursing ethics or bioethics? If such virtue can be taught, we as nursing leaders and educators, we often think about how should we do it? Are we integrated into nursing school curricula from the beginning of a nursing program? Or as Dr. Isabel Hampton-Robb from Johns Hopkins suggested back in 1900, ought it be a separate course in junior or senior year as it is done where I taught at St. Joseph's and at the University of Connecticut? Are we teaching virtue, moral rectitude, moral comportment, or are we teaching it through clinical role modeling, slowly unpacking of what the essence of nursing ethics is all about during the entire educational journey, or are we really teaching something called clinical bioethics? I think they're two different subjects. First, we must ask, as if Meno asked for a working definition of virtue, what is nursing ethics? Just like the phenomenologist Max van Manen said, qualis tiestem, what is it? What is nursing ethics? And more importantly, how should it be studied by nursing philosophers, nursing scholars, nursing educators, and nursing practitioners? Van Manen would say to study it as if it were a phenomenon. Like nursing ethics and phenomenological attitude is an intensified form of experience with pronounced ego involvement. The truth in this way of thinking would help us to disclose the meaning and the value of nursing ethics as it is consciously constituted with the principle of intentionality. I'm going to get back to that in a little bit, but please let me just kind of hold my hand. I'm going to walk you through and talk about some scholars who have influenced, as Sarah asked me, who have influenced my perception of looking at one part of the Blackbird of nursing ethics. First, Dr. Taylor. She has discussed her ontological investigation into the very nature of nursing as a moral profession and described the internal morality of nursing that is grounded in nursing's moral obligations to pursue the aim of nursing, which she defined as the health of persons so as to care in such a way that they can achieve the goods of their life. She described, and she just did quite beautifully, the achievement of that aim being subsequently grounded in the obligations, as she says, to think, to act, and to be good. She introduces the model of professional caring with the 6 elements she just described. Carol was an enormous influence to me during my dissertation preparation and during my 2 years at Georgetown. Another important person who has influenced how I think about nursing ethics is Dr. Masha Fowler. She's a nursing educator, a social ethics scientist, and a frequent contributor to the nursology movement that began in 2018. She has said this about the concept of nursing ethics. It's philosophically informed. So we have to kind of take that step to the philosophical level here. She said it's relational, it's contextual, it's rooted in experience. It's about the moral character of nurses. It's an alloy. What an interesting use of a word. It's an ally of 2 substances, she says, skilled practice and ethical comportment. And that equals good nursing. She also said it's an enhancement of our values, and it's an enhancement of the ends of what we do, the real telos of what we do. She says it's a positive enterprise that is not conflict or problem-based. It's a preventive ethics. And I assume what she means by that, it's not the reactive ethics that I do every day. I've got 2 clinical consults to get to after today. That's a very more reactive ethics in which I will go and figure out what the problem is and try to help resolve it. But she talks about nursing ethics as being a preventive ethics. She talks about it being a way to build and preserve relationships. And she talks about ethics addressing nursing concerns. She says, and she recommends, that nursing is better served by its own ethics than it is by bioethics. The third person who influenced me is Sally Goodell, who Carol has already mentioned. She did a beautiful Hegelian-like dialectic, but not the typical thesis, antithesis, synthesis type, but she labeled it as a dialectic of immediacy, opposition, and the very important component of reconciliation to construct layers of ethics. She defined 3 layers. The first is the pre-modern layer, subjective, unreflective, uncritical, an ethic that just intuits the good, an ethic that one could think of more in a very, a way that you might derive it from a different source. She also defined like family or tradition. She then went on to a pre-modern ethic layer, which is more objective, very rationally detached, things like principles, codes, and theories, normative kinds of theories. But her third layer is where nursing ethics flourishes. Her third layer was a layer of ethics that she labeled postmodern ethics. And it's a layer of engagement. It's a layer of a relational narrative. It's a narrative that combines that rationality with emotion and imagination into what she called intersubjective contingency, when a nurse and a patient construct the patient's meaning of the good, but that one patient, the complete antithesis to the other layers. And as Carol said, this was her philosophical underpinning of her existential advocacy as the central phenomenon of nursing. Also, Dr. Ann Bishop, she just died last year at the age of 88. Carol did an ontological investigation. Sally Gatto did a more dialectic investigation, but Dr. Bishop did a real phenomenological analysis of the nature of nursing ethics. She opined that nursing ethics articulates the moral sense of nursing and how it gets fulfilled, rather than applying ethical theories to nursing practice. Also, Dr. Alyssa Kars, who has a chapter in Dr. Taylor and Dr. DeLauro's book on human flourishing. She spoke to the moral call that nurses hear, and I use that in quotes, for sustenance and support of vulnerable human beings. And she says to ameliorate, the call is, the isolating impact of their suffering, but grounded in moral obligations to help in the work of healing. And she said one can do this by cultivating the virtues of healthy empathy, sustaining compassion, and joining in solidarity with those in need. And also I'm going to end this little journey of famous women with Dr. Margaret Farley, who was once the director of bioethics at Yale. And in one of her addresses that was published in a little book called Compassionate Respect. She said, respect for persons unleashes a compassionate response to real persons in their concrete reality. It is this very compassion, and this is just so beautiful what she said, that attracts health professionals to others, that arrests our gaze and focuses it in order that we do not pass by those in need. These 6 women were some of the most important influences to me to understand the nature of nursing ethics. The lingering perception of that arresting gaze and focusing it, I would suggest, is the very action we take to describe, not define, but to describe the truth about nursing ethics. It is not healthcare ethics. It is not bioethics. It is a different phenomenon. To better look at the blackboard of nursing ethics from another perspective, I reviewed the contents of the latest issue of Nursing Ethics and found that there were original manuscripts related to, for example, trust building in the dementia population, moral courage, moral burnout, compassion fatigue. There are also 3 review articles, 4 actually, and 3 of them were related to moral distress and moral injury. I also looked at the January issue of the American Journal of Bioethics and was fascinated by the case study that addressed what the authors called moral distress and the marginalization of nurses. Still talking in 2023 about the marginalization of nurses. The title of that particular entry in the Journal of Bioethics was, quote, "Please don't make me do this. Please don't make me do this." I got that call today. Please don't make me do this. It is a refrain from nurses and physicians I hear over and over again when doing clinical ethics consultations, performing CPR on patients whose families want everything done, including CPR, often in the context of medical physiological futility, multi-system organ failure, very advanced age, and at times counter to the patient's living will. It is the typical ethics consultation response to this situation I'd like to look at. Is it nursing ethics? Is it clinical bioethics? I don't think it's entirely one or the other. This is clinical bioethics mostly, but I would not throw away that serpent's head of bioethics, as Dr. Fowler called it, to resolve the threat to the integrity that nurses are feeling when they say, "Don't make me do this." Aristotle described the unexpected reversal in the expected tick-tock of one's personal life. He called this a peripeteia, a time when the talk is not followed by a tick, if you know what I mean. And it could be a stroke, it could be a car crash, it could be COVID-19, anything that could result in a situation that the family might request something physiologically futile that has been sort of triggered by this peripeteia that Aristotle described. Nursing ethics, however, is embedded in nursing practice as a relational narrative that, Sally Gatto would say, embodies that person lying in the bed and attempts to resolve the dissonance and the cacophony that the peripeteia produced. This is nursing ethics, conducting a symphony of caring and reconciliation and creating something out of the chaos for the patient, for his family, and for the nurses. It's a response to pain, to sorrow, to grief, to suffering. This is when the act of nursing and the aesthetic process of nursing can be put together. As Dr. Peggy Chin would describe, and I think she's here with us today, she described this as envisioning and rehearsing creative processes that can enhance the narrative skills that we as nurses use as a participant in the emerging life stories of those who we care for through those peripeteias. If you were to read any of my ethics consults, you will rarely find words like respect for autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence per se, but you will find words like reconciliation, engagement, cura personalis, existential advocacy, intrinsic dignity, amelioration of extrinsic indignities, You will also see notes about virtues of health professionals, effacement of self-interest, prudence, intellectual honesty, compassion, benevolence, and yes, existential advocacy, and my favorite that I learned at Georgetown, lamentation. Often I speak to the nurse being the conductor of a symphony, often at the end of life, that was my dissertation work, the one that ought to be orchestrating, for example, the act of terminal withdrawal of life support. In respect for Dr. Harvey, I went back to the John Hopkins School of Nursing by reading a book I have, which was written by Isabel Hampton Robin. I just got to show it to you. It's such this old book. It's got all these brown pages. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. As I mentioned, I may not have mentioned it yet, but she was the second superintendent of nursing at John Hopkins. She was born in 1859, died in 1910, the same year that Nightingale died. She authored the book, Nursing, Its Principles and Practices, and she also authored the book called, none other than what we're talking about today, Nursing Ethics. She wrote that text, and she wrote that what constitutes nursing ethics is the rules of conduct adapted to the many diverse circumstances attending the nurse, attending the sick. But there's also behaviors that she called rules of etiquette. She said, and I quote, nursing ethics should be commenced from the moment the pupil nurse enters the hospital. So she answered one of my questions. And from the beginning of her term of probation, it should go hand in hand with her training in the theory of the practice of nursing, sounding more and more like Copper's Ways of Knowing to me. Panelist Salisbury wrote that any nursing philosophy ought to have ontological, epistemological, and ethical claims to it. I believe that we have the ontological claims, just like Carol Taylor beautifully described. And we also have the epistemological claims as described by Copper and endorsed and expanded by Peggy Chin and Kramer with identification of the patterns of knowing in nursing, ethics, aesthetics, personal knowing, empirics, and emancipatory knowing. The path of scholars to follow now is to make firmer the ethical claims. We've got the other two down, but we need some firm analysis of these ethical claims and go back to nurses' legacy by describing ethics and its future within the nursing discipline and, of course, within the practice. Yes, codes of ethics we're going to hear about next have their use and have their purpose, and Dr. Robb said the same thing. They are codifications, not oaths. They are argumentum ad recudium, right? They're about codifications from authority. They're argumentum ad populum, meaning that they appeal to the general opinion of persons putting the code together. Codes set standards for practice. Nursing ethics, on the other hand, is the very central nature of nursing in its entirety. I often mention reconciliation in my ethics consults in reference to families who, for example, cannot reconcile death after neurological criteria. I get that call every other week. Reconciliation is an acceptance of being resigned to something not desired, like death, like terminal illness. So we know why patients' family ask for things. I believe nursing ethics, though, will help guide families to reconciliation as they figuratively sit and stand as vigil at the bedside, like you would see in the tablets of Ars Moriendi. Fowler opined that reconciliation requires a transformation, a change towards justice, fairness, healing, and health. Let's consider a reconciliation that nursing ethics is tethered to its legacy from the 1800s and onward. And if one were to think of nursing ethics as an object of inquiry, the noema, and nurses are the subjects of that inquiry, noesis, then phenomenology would be a very appropriate method to do this inquiry where consciousness meets the experience. It's the intentional looking back, if you will, at the phenomenon of nursing ethics. The truth of nursing ethics is there, but its source may not be the naive realism of common sense or preconceptions, but it's a more critical realism achieved in a conscious attitude where lived experience discloses meaning, not discovers it, discloses it, and helps to describe something's fundamental structure. The subjects in this knowledge and truth pursuit can very well be practicing nurses and our nursing students. And I ask them all the time to draw pictures for me and write poems and get to the very essence of some of these concepts we're dealing with in nursing. I encourage this phenomenological investigation as one that can meet the challenge to birth a robust scholarly description, not definition of nursing ethics, which was our Blackter today. Now I'm going to finish. I always typically end with another poem. When I look at another one of the books, old books I have about nursing ethics, I have this one, also called Ethics, a Textbook for Nurses. It was really written by Charlotte Aikens in 1916. I have the 1943 version, and as I opened it, this little tattered piece of paper fell out. It was brown, it was rough around the edges, but it was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Santa Filomena. And it was tucked into this nursing ethics book. It was a tribute to Nightingale. Remember, these people are all around the same time, so they loved that deontological duty-based ethics of rules, right? But I just want to finish with a little piece of that poem. And in that poem, which was a tribute to Florence Nightingale, and really where the idea of the lady with the lamp came from, the wounded from the battle plain in dreary hospitals of pain, the cheerless corridors, the cold and stony floors, lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see, pass through the glimmering gloom and flit from room to room, and slow as in a dream of bliss, the speechless sufferer, the patient, the pain, the soldier, turns to kiss her shadow as it falls upon the darkening walls. To me, that poem really encapsulates what it means when a nurse walks into a patient's room. And with that, I thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to hear more.
Barbara, that was beautiful. Thank you for bringing us along. That was a great review.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Now, I am so pleased to take our conversation in a little bit of a different direction and ask Ms. Kara Curry, Senior Policy and Ethics Advisor at the American Nurses Association Center for Ethics and Human Rights, to give us some perspectives based in your experience with healthcare ethics. With the revision of the Code of Ethics underway, can you share a little bit about your background, its background, and the purpose of the code?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say that I'm so honored to be included on this esteemed panel to honor the legacy of Dr. Harvey. And I have to say, I do not take it lightly that I am sitting amongst giants on this panel. So I absolutely just wanted to say that first. But I'm happy to be able to have the opportunity to talk about the revision of the Code of Ethics for Nurses. And I appreciate this question because I feel like the background history and purpose of the code are important to understand. Because I feel like when we know where we've come from as a profession and what our foundation is, and what we've heard much of today from the other panelists, when we understand that, we have a better handle on where we're going. So in terms of when the code began, the original Code of Ethics was written in 1950 and has been either amended, modified, or revised at least 7 times since then. And so the latest iteration of the code was published in 2015. As Dr. Fatone mentioned, we are currently revising that version and plan to publish in 2025. And so initially the code was made up of these 17 declarative provisions that spoke to things like the conservation of life and end of life, the interdisciplinary collaboration and professionalism, amongst other topics. And then eventually the provisions were modified down to 9 and included in-depth interpretive statements of each of those 9 provisions. So the purpose of the code is to establish the ethical standard for the profession and provide guidance to nurses facing ethical challenges. And that guidance is where the interpretive statements come in. Some may not be familiar with this, but the structure of the code is such that the first 3 provisions describe the most fundamental values and commitments of the nurse and really focus on the nurse to patient relationship. And then the next 3 provisions address the boundaries of duty and loyalty. And then finally, the final provisions address the aspects of duties beyond the individual patient encounter and extend to colleagues, extend to the community and to society overall. So the goal really is to articulate the core values, the virtues, the duties, and the ideals of the profession. And while the ethical values are stable and are a constant that we stand on and we have stood on since the first code was written in 1950, the circumstances of the healthcare landscape, and I'll even add at this point, the legislative landscape that surrounds us, are ever changing. And this requires us to periodically examine the existing language in the code, and is the reason why we describe it as a living document.
That's great. Thank you for that. I just am interested in now, what are the challenges that you feel like are faced in creating a revised relevant code for nurses who are responding to these very complex in our situations in our healthcare system?
Yeah, I think we can all agree that our profession is facing difficult times that are hard to deal with. And so obviously we're taking this revision very seriously. So much has taken place since 2015 when the code was last revised, and the effects and outcomes of the pandemic have caused us to see our world and our profession in a different light, I would say. So I would really identify that there are some themes or concepts that show up throughout the code that have definitely been challenging during the revision process. So outlining those social issues, right? The impacts of social and structural determinants of health have been extremely challenging to organize and format. And I think that that's mostly because there's a debate about how much nurses should really be responsible for. So there are some nurses who want to go to work, do their job, do it well, and work within the bandwidth that they have, all while exercising ethical practice. And then they want to go home. And then you have some nurses who are social advocates and social activists and working to advance the profession in a broader way. And when I say broader, that doesn't diminish the impact of the nurse who wants to go to work, give compassionate care to their patients, and go home, right? So the challenge is really about how we ensure this code resonates with all nurses in all practice settings, at all levels of expertise, and all levels of advocacy, because advocacy happens not only at the bedside and in the community, but also in the boardroom and on Capitol Hill. Also, I would highlight that the legislative landscape has really impacted our work and has caused us to evaluate some of our language in the code around legal versus ethical implications. Asking ourselves, how do ethics and the law work together, but also what do we do when they conflict? And trying to outline that they aren't always aligned, right? And diving into how the code can help nurses navigate this is a challenge. We see state laws being passed that compromise our ethical integrity and professional values. One of the core concepts of the code and discussed in provision 1 is this idea, and what we've been talking about today, of valuing human dignity and respect and self-determination. And we're finding that some of the laws being passed are the antithesis of what provision 1 means and what it stands for. So again, how do we navigate this? So in our revision discussions, we're bringing the conversation back to the basics of humanizing people, not othering people, and really trying to grapple with where and how we address all of the isms, and including racism, and naturally weaving anti-racist concepts throughout the code, because that is a part of our social ethical makeup as a profession. And then, of course, we want to highlight the good. We talk about a lot of the challenges and the things that we're up against, but we do want to highlight the good and all that we add to the health of our patients and the health of the environment and the health of our society, both nationally and globally. And we hear it year after year that nurses are the most trusted profession, and there is a reason for that. Through the lens of the public, we have been identified as ethical and trustworthy. And so we want this code revision to help us maintain that reputation. So yeah, there is much to consider, to say the least.
Do you feel like that the code can impact the future of nursing?
The short answer to that is yes, I do think the code can impact the future of nursing, but I think it will be up to us. And when I say us, I'm talking about the nursing profession or the nurse collective, if you will. Obviously, I am entrenched in this work now, and admittedly have been able to see the value of the code much more keenly than I ever have before. The majority of my career thus far has been at the bedside. And prior to this shift in my career and becoming trained in bioethics and clinical ethics, the code was something I used for a class in nursing school. And then I'm not sure where it went after that. And I have to be transparent about that because I know certainly that so many nurses can relate to this. But as I sit in this space and have been immersed in this work, I've been able to reflect upon my time in clinical practice, and I see vivid instances where I could have leaned on the code. And I also see how my relational inclination towards my patients and my colleagues and my community was directly aligned with what already existed in the code. And that insight has been tremendously satisfying and cathartic for me personally. But I say all that to say that I think we can do a much better job at incorporating the code of ethics and ethics education in general into the nursing curricula. I was beaming, listening to you, Dr. Jacobs, and your accounts and review of all of the integral and important nurse ethicists that have come before us, including Dr. Fowler, who is a big, huge part, and Dr. Taylor, a huge part of this code revision. And so I know that this panel and many in the audience have dedicated their careers to this work and would agree with me that ethics education should be considered a crucial component of the nursing curricula. It doesn't matter where we practice or what stage we are in our careers, ethical challenges will show up in everything we do. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how familiar are we with the code of ethics, and whose responsibility is it to inform and educate nurses and make them more familiar with the code? As nurses, we need to increase our own knowledge and seek a broader understanding so that it can be amplified and better understood. And I think we know what that can potentially look like in nursing schools, but what does this look like for continuing education and nurses already in practice, in academia and research, and so on? So yes, I do think that it can impact the future. And I think one aspect of this revision process that I'm looking forward to is the development and creation of practical examples that will be directly tied to each of the interpretive statements. And so they won't be embedded in the code itself, but they will be accessible through our website, and I'm sure will be valuable to nurses who are seeking a more meaningful and practical understanding of the content of the code.
Thank you so much, Kara. That was wonderful. I appreciate you sharing from yourself. And we also look forward to the interpretive statements because that is going to be so helpful, giving examples. And I appreciate what the panel have brought forward today. And I do have a question or two from the audience that I'd like to offer to the panel. So my colleagues, one of the questions that's come up is the importance of virtue. And where do you see that in professional education? We've talked about the ethics, but what about the virtue? Okay. Carol, you want to go?
I'm sorry, I had to get off my mute. One of the things I do with students is simply to ask them how they calibrate their moral compass. And it leads to, and they, like, I think that's hard content sometimes to absorb. And so in our second class with the advanced practice nurses, they tell a story of an ethical challenge that they encountered in their practice. They critique how they responded. They look at what informs their deliberations. And then we talk about moral agency. But I'd say half talk about virtue ethics being essential to how they calibrate their moral compass. And then, it leads into a conversation about those human excellencies, those dispositions that Barbara talked about to do moral good. And it becomes a recurrent theme throughout the course. So I think paying attention, curious others, what do you think?
Barbara?
I don't mean to be too provocative here, but I love these questions that are in the chat box. And I recognize Mary Louise. She and I actually graduated together from Georgetown, and she asked about the issue of virtues. In sort of a provocative way, I think all that time we spend on moral distress, wouldn't you love to see a time when nurses were not morally distressed, that things were going well, that there weren't threats to their integrity? I really think nurses' voices, and I use that in quotes, needs to be louder, needs to be more prominent. I'm trying to get a nursing ethics committee within my system of 7 hospitals. We have our typical ethics committee and we have the ethics consultation service, but why not have a nursing ethics committee so that we can set a course, we can make a chart, we can have goals, we can have a telos, we can bring the idea of nursing ethics alive into our clinical practices. Right now, I think it's shrouded. I think it might be unpacked with certain cases, but every time I write a consult, every single time, I talk about compassion. I talk about virtues. I talk about, don't just be beneficent, be benevolent, be kind, be gentle. And someone did that you know how the JAMA writes a poem every month, or is it every week they publish JAMA? I don't know, but there's always a poem there, and or a story. And a doctor wrote about, bring the personal back to taking care of my mother in the intensive care. Bring the personal back. And someone else wrote about AI coming forth, and are we going to lose that relational connection? Yes. If we don't, we can stop it though, or we can at least do the work that we have to do as nurses, as a group, with a louder voice, demonstrating to this medical community that we're here. We're here loud and clear, and we're here because we have that moral imperative of doing good. So I'm just going to say, I think we need to talk louder.
Yeah, Barbara, I will just echo that. I think that this is an important point to close with, this idea of creating voice. And I challenge nurse leaders to support the nurses in this voice, this idea of creating opportunities to work together and creating. Margaret, were you gonna jump in?
Yes, but I don't want to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think for faculty and pre-licensure and advanced practice and PhD programs along the spectrum, as well as practicing nurses in any environment, we need to model the virtues. We need to show the students and the new graduates what it really means to be a nurse and to care and to do good and to be kind, like Dr. Jacobs is saying. We get so tied up with the technology and writing our notes and making sure everything's on time, we forget to ask the patient about their family. We don't look at people's eyes and note, wow, what beautiful blue eyes you have. I mean, that's being virtuous. And I think if we can model that, hopefully our mentees will pick up on it.
Well done. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for your kind attention and participation with us today. Thank you again for joining us for the 21st Annual John Collins Harvey Lecture, and good evening.
Thank you.